Hey folks, welcome to this talk on saloons and antebellum Sacramento, pre-Civil War Sacramento. And I want to thank ACC Senior Services for making this event possible. I'm talking about history today, but ACC Senior Services will provide you with content on music, nutrition, consumer health, any number of things. ACC Senior Services, their production team, do a great job, and they're with us today. And of course, we are in the Sacramento Room. My name is James Scott. I'm the archivist in the room, and the room is really the historical fulcrum of Sacramento. You can look all around the room. You can see this beautiful place that's been around for really over a century, opened in April 1918. And was the center of library life in the capital city. And today it is now an OpenStax reading room and archive dedicated to the history of Sacramento City, Sacramento County, and California history. So we are just tickled as heck to be here. And I should also mention, if you want to get a really great tour of the room, go to the ACC Senior Services YouTube page and watch Secrets of the Sacramento Room. It's roughly an hour-long odyssey that will take you through the secrets and the collections and all the peculiarities of the Sacramento Room. So with that said, we're going to talk about something completely different today. The heart of today's talk is the saloon. And the word saloon is kind of a perversion of the French word salon, meaning library or drawing room. And so we Americans, we take these words from all over the world and we make them our own. And in this case, we took salon and made it saloon. And it's really kind of a feature of the American West. And as we look at the American West, and it's firmly entrenched in popular memory of Americans, but also folks throughout the world, right? They can think of movies they've seen with John Wayne just kind of moseying across and bellying up to the bar and saying, "Hey, Pilgrim," or maybe that was a different movie. Doesn't matter. But the fact is, the saloon is a central feature of the American West and American history. Richard Erdos, an Austrian who wrote really the defining book on saloons, throws out this quote: "With the exception of Little Bighorn, all Western American history was made within the saloon." This is an utterly crazy and completely untrue statement, but the idea is that we can look at the saloon as this vignette, right? So we use the saloon as a prism of history, not only to learn about American culture, but to learn about all sorts of things that speak to the American experience, whether that be politics or food or law enforcement, crime and punishment, any number of things. So while we think of a saloon as a bar, possibly a place where you can gamble, it was also a place where church could be held. It was also a place where court could be put into session. And it was also a place where you could get your hair cut at a makeshift barbershop. So a lot of things going on. And we're going to zoom in, of course, and we are going to talk about the Sacramento experience and the saloon. So at this point, we're going to turn to the central building in Sacramento. And this enables us to kind of consider where the first saloon was in Sacramento. And you have to look at it in one of two ways. When we look at Greater Sacramento, that's Front Street all the way out to, say, 31st, and then the B Street levee all the way down to Broadway, we have to consider Sutter's Fort. And this picture right here that shows you the central building, This image was taken in roughly 1873, and it shows you kind of a really rundown central building. It would have been reconstituted in the late 19th century by the native sons and daughters of the American West who rehabbed Sutter's Fort. But back in the day, 1839, all the way through the fall of Sutter's Fort, this would have been kind of the central feature of the fort. And it's here where quite possibly Sacramento's very first bartender had his place, in the basement of the central building. His name was Peter Slater, also known as Parley, an interesting guy, very enterprising, described as affable, handsome, engaging, but he tended bar down in the basement of the central building, and came from Missouri with his wife and 9 kids, coming across the country. Sadly, his wife passed away, but he got to Sacramento and started this business. And with 9 kids, you needed to do something that was pretty lucrative. Well, Peter Slater ran a pretty lucrative business. So in the basement of the central building, you could get for about 35 cents a shot of whiskey. You could also pay $35 for a quart of whiskey. Probably very, very likely at this time, 1846, 47, 48, that's whiskey that would have been imported, okay? So we know that the success of Slater was pretty darn good, because when you look at Sacramento County probate records, we know that his holdings included a couple of different things that would indicate that he did well. He was able to accumulate 2 gallons worth of gold dust. That's doing pretty well, folks, in 1840, 1849. So he also, by the way, he passed away in December 1849, and so released were these probate records. We also know that he had an affinity for India Pale Ale, that great beer that we drink today, that beer that could be, sort of brewed in transit from London to South Asia. And in this case, the vital factor being hops that sort of worked as a preservative, but also gives it that really special taste. So Slater had 24 bottles of India Pale Ale in his estate. So, central building. Now, a little bit of a description comes from a fellow named William Grimshaw. Grimshaw, interesting guy, was at the fort for a couple of years, worked as a clerk, born in New York, came out to California to see the elephant, and this is what he said about that center building that was under the charge of Peter Slater. In the center, and I quote, "In the center of the inside of the fort was a 2-story adobe building, still standing, lower portion of which was used as a bar room with a Monte table or 2 in it. This bar was crowded with customers night and day and never closed from one month's end to the other." So a happening place. And by the way, I should mention Monte, one of the big games pre its banning in the mid-1850s, kind of like the shell game. But in this case, instead of looking at shells and guessing under which shell you would have an object, it was played with cards, okay? And you had to guess which card was where. So really, really popular. So that is location number 1 for the first saloon in Sacramento. Now, I want to pivot really quickly to Kunzel's map, which is going to pop up here. Now, why are we looking at Kunzel's map? We're looking at Kunzel's map because we want to think about the early origins of drink in Sacramento. Not imported, but actually made organically in this wonderful, wonderful agricultural Eden that we know as the Sacramento Valley. These massive alluvial fans pushed out all sorts of wonderful, wonderful soil. Cache Creek, Stone Creek, Dry Creek, down into the valley, giving us the black soil that we enjoy today, and a source for making beer, and in the case of Sutter's Fort, brandy. So if you look at Kunzel's map, you're going to see a red circle kind of up near the top, or where there's the pond. And it's there where Sutter had his Brauerei, so brewery, and Brennerie, which is where he had a distillery. And it's there that for a short period of time, he was making beer, very likely a lager-style beer, kind of light. We know lagers, right? Kind of light in taste, low in alcohol content. And then also sherry. The sherry was gathered, or the contents for the sherry, the mash, typically gathered from the riverbanks of the lush rivers, Sacramento and American, where Sutter's slaves, Native American and Polynesian, could gather berries of various types to make the mash and then to make the sherry. Didn't last long, wasn't a tenable thing for Sutter, but it does tell us that there was this ability to produce alcohol at Sutter's Fort very early on. Now, let's pivot, if you will, to the first presence of a saloon within really the inner core. And when we're talking about the inner core of the city, early on Sacramento, we're looking at Sutter's Embarcadero. That's basically being roughly Front and J, Front and K streets. And this spot comes around in roughly 1848. So gold is discovered in January 1848, and things move very, very fastly for very quickly for Sacramento. We have the development of infrastructure. We have the development of any number of commercial outlets, and of course, places for gaming and places for drink. And in this case, if you look at the map, you might see just up J Street, there's a tent. And that is our very first saloon in Sacramento proper, roughly 2nd and J. It went by various different names, but the one that really sticks is the Stinking Tent. And you can maybe guess why it was called the Stinking Tent. It also went by the Miners Exchange, the Big Tent, or the City Diggins. And it was at this spot that really the first salooning experience was provided in what we would consider, again, that city core. Okay, so moving on, let's get a description of the Stinking Tent. And with this picture of John Frederick Morse. So John Frederick Morse is significant because he's really the fellow who published the first history of Sacramento in 1853, a physician who came from the Northeast and has a very biased sort of outlook when it comes to saloon culture in Sacramento. Morse was a Puritan from the Northeast and did not like what he saw. And I quote from his book when he talks about the Stinking Tent: "Music and a decorated bar and obscene pictures were the great attractions that lined this whirlpool of fortune, and coerced into the vortex of penury and disgrace many an American who had come to California without his morals or decencies, which he was taught at home." What a shame. That's me saying that. Toilers of the country, including traders, mechanics, miners, and speculators, lawyers, doctors, ministers, concentrated at this gambling focus like flying insects around the lighted candle at night, and like such insects, seldom left the delusive glare until the scorched and consumed by the watchfires of destruction. Now, let me tell you something, folks. We do know that Dr. Morse is being very judgmental, but years on, he became a gambler himself with racehorsing. So let's just put that out there. So that's a good look into the Stinking Tent, Sacramento proper's first saloon. Now, what comes next is a wonderful case study called the Round Tent. Now, the Round Tent is next in line of this evolution of salooning in Sacramento. Why is it significant? It's significant for various reasons. First of all, I would say that it was first and foremost a meeting place. And with the California Gold Rush, we have the attraction of folks from all over the world, different nationalities, different races, different ethnicities. And it's in this place where we have the reminiscences and thoughts of a miner from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania named William Johnston. And Johnston's words are important because he describes the round tent as a veritable congress of nations, which as Sacramentans, it's kind of part of our DNA, our diversity and our embrace of diversity. There are African Americans, there are those from South America who are in the round tent, there are Chinese Americans in the round tent. Again, kind of a United Nations of gambling and drinking is the best way I can go ahead and put it. One thing to consider is the fact that the West was very difficult to survive in. And as one observer put it, these notions, these artificial notions of race kind of went by the wayside when it came to surviving. So often one's ability to be resourceful, one's ability to be gritty, one's ability to just get by from day to day mattered more than these artificial concepts of race and ethnicity and nationality. That isn't to say that there isn't a prevalence of racism in antebellum Sacramento. There most certainly was. But there is a sense, according to one theory called the labor theory of value, which was expounded by a historian at Portland State University named David Johnson, that again, your medical degree might be great and your law degree might be great, might be just fine, and your ability to run a business is great, but what matters in the American West is survival and getting by day to day to day. And so things to consider when we look at the round tent. Now, when it comes to other races in Sacramento at this time, we know that the African American community was setting up saloon locations along 3rd Street and I Street, the Delmonico, Hackett's, the Indian Chief, the St. Charles were all African American establishments. Also along I Street, Chinese Americans were setting up saloons and gambling houses as well. And of course, these communities would grow over time. So things to consider. I want to come back to the round tent, and I want to talk a little bit about the importance also of what's inside a saloon. We got an interesting take from Dr. Morse earlier, but what about Johnston? What does he have to say? He says, and he speaks about the bar area, the bar area as a conspicuous feature was decorated with large and costly mirrors behind shelves adorned with a glittery array of decanters containing sparkling liquors. There were extraordinary pyramids of lemons, towering peaks of Havana cigars, and gorgeous vases containing peppermint, of all things. A bevy of patrons thronged this attractive bar, and there was a constant clicking of glasses, popping of corks, amid the gurgling sound of tut-tut, etc., etc., etc. And again, this is an integrated scene. I might also say Jay Goldsboro Bruff, who I'm going to talk about in just a moment, he also mentions that when it comes to capitalism, which is where we are, right? Capitalism in the raw American West, again, these artificial notions of race mean less when, in the end, you're trying to make money, okay? So moving on to the Eagle Theater, which is a really important feature when we talk about the round tent. So I want to talk about the concept of this thing called the Concert Saloon. The Concert Saloon, you can kind of figure it out from the name. We have the saloon feature, but we also have the attachment of live entertainment. Now, this is a concept that was born in England in the 1840s, eventually made its way across the Atlantic and then into the American West. And the idea is that, especially with what we're looking at here in Sacramento, the idea is that we can take live entertainment, connect it to a saloon. And in Sacramento, we had the Eagle Theater, 1849, and the Round Tent in 1849, and those were merged to create this Concert Saloon, which really brings us closer to what we might even think of as a modern casino, right? Without the food in this case, maybe, but we do have drink, we have entertainment, and we have gaming, all within a line of sight. So short of saying this is California's very first casino, you kind of get a sense for what was happening at this time, 1849, 1850, with the Concert Saloon concept. Okay, so moving on, I want to also revisit the idea of beer. So we talked about Sutter's Fort and the idea of beer production there and liquor production there. Pretty soon, within this wonderful agricultural hub, we are the farm to fork capital. It's not a new thing, it's been around for a really long time. But within this context of great production of agriculture, we see brewing really start to take off. And our kind of de facto first brewer in the area is a German named Peter Cadell. Peter Cadell, German fellow from Baden-Württemberg, started the first brewery, which was very close to Sutter's Fort. Now, according to Bruff, who I mentioned earlier, he remembers going to this brewery that was operated by Cadell and a sign over the top saying Galena Brewery, Galena, which is a mineral. So an interesting name, but it would soon grow into being known as the Sacramento Brewery. And just to give you a sense of what was being brewed at the time, ale was being brewed. So probably a standard English ale, fermented for a short time, and also brewed at a pretty darn high temperature. And Bruff recalls paying 25 cents for a glass of beer that he thought tasted pretty darn good. Now, an interesting thing about our brewmaster, Peter Cadell, was he didn't come to Sacramento to brew. He came to Sacramento to find gold. And when that didn't work out, he pivoted over to being a dairyman. When that didn't work out, he became a brewmaster. And he did this for quite a while. We see a lot of reinvention in the American West. Anything that's going to work, anything that's going to pay the bills, and any commercial vacuum that exists being filled, right? The invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand, really in practice. So eventually, Cadell sells his brewery to a fellow named Philip Schelt, and it becomes the Sacramento Brewery and sort of keeps going all the way through the 19th century. That image that we showed earlier of the Sacramento Brewery is from roughly 1880. There it is, 1880. And so much later on than antebellum Sacramento, and it would have been located over by Sutter's Fort, where it is today, but a larger production, probably an element of mechanization. Of course, you know, we're really we're in the midst of the Industrial Revolution going on, so a much bigger production and distribution going on at that time. So that's really kind of the genesis of homemade, locally made beer in Sacramento. And of course, if you're going to run a saloon, you got to have beer, right, folks? Okay. So let's pivot over to crime and punishment in the context of salooning. So the Mansion House is going to pop up here, and this is the Mansion House Saloon. It is it's a section out of a bird's eye view from an artist named George Victor Cooper, and he did this bird's eye view of Sacramento in roughly 1850. And there it is, the Mansion House, which was originally opened up by Sam Brannan, who was not the best of human beings, but an absolute business savant who made lots of money mining the miners. And so the Mansion House would have been at the foot of J Street, so Front and J. And it's here that we have a revolution. Mark Eifler, who's a historian, professor up at University of Portland, refers to this incident that I'm going to describe as one of the very first revolutions in making modern Sacramento modern and more civilized by Western standards. So in February 1851, there is gaming taking place right outside the Mansion Saloon. And it's a beautiful day. Pretty soon, outdoor gambling is going to be outlawed, but at this point, it's still okay. So in front of the Mansion House, Monty is being played, and it's there that a young man named Frederick Rowe is playing. And there's a crowd gathered around, and they're watching everything take place. And one miner accuses Rowe of cheating. And Rowe says, "Mind your own business." But the miner won't stop. He's insistent that something's got to change because he doesn't like what he's seeing. And so a fight ensues. The two are rolling around in the street. Dust is flying everywhere. At this point, a wheelwright from Ohio, his name's Charles Myers, he comes up from the river and he sees something wrong. And he's known as a really good man, just kind of a straight shooter, an honest player, comes up and breaks up the two and says, "Look, you've got to stop this. And if anything, it's got to be a fair fight." At this moment, Rowe, by the way, who's heavily intoxicated, pulls a pistol right out of his breeches, points it at Myers, and fires, and hits Myers right in the head. Myers hits the ground like a sack of potatoes, and chaos ensues. The city marshal comes in, grabs Rowe, takes him to the jailhouse, and justice be done, right? This is now under the authority of the Sacramento police at the time. By the way, a really small force for a really, really crazy city. The statistics bear that out. They were really, really outgunned in a number of different ways. So, thing to think about in this situation is that Sacramento is young. In terms of civic institutions, there's not a whole lot going on. So it's easy for public opinion to really swell, and the emergence of vigilante committees, vigilance committees to really take hold. And that's what happens here. So by the end of the day, by the way, this is a relatively early thing taking place, a morning gambling a situation gone wrong. By, let's see, late afternoon, Myers, Rowe is sort of sobering up, but there's a massive crowd that wants justice, and it wants justice right away. And so what they eventually do is they break into the jail, they take Rowe, and Rowe is sobering up, and he's starting to feel like, this is not looking good for me. And he starts to become contrite and come clean and say, "Look, I didn't mean to do this. I did it in a moment of passion. These things happen." But it doesn't matter, because the Vigilance Committee, the group, takes Rowe over to a spot called the Horse Market. And it's at the Horse Market, which is roughly on 7th and K. You can see there, folks, there are large trees at the Horse Market. And this is where the Vigilance Committee will take Frederick Rowe. They will ask him to give his final words. They gave him a glass of water, and all he could say was, "Lord, have mercy on my soul." And at that point, he is hanging from a tree, and is kind of a twist in this story, this mystical story. Charles Myers, who had been shot earlier in the day, is still alive after Rowe dies, but soon thereafter he passes away himself. So what does this mean? February 1851, you would think that those seeing that Roe was heavily intoxicated, especially those within the temperance movement, would want to have some sort of accountability and some sort of control over the liquor industry, over the salooning industry at this time. But the fact is, salooning is so lucrative for the city. Every table is taxed. Liquor licenses are given out by the fiat of the mayor of Sacramento. It is just too good. It's just too easy a way to make money, to help construct roads, to help construct sidewalks and planking, that it's really hard for Sacramento and its city council at that time to just get rid of salooning. It's just too much of a thing. And by the way, the same people that are on the city council enjoy saloons as well. So despite the temperance movement, despite the fact that there is a huge, huge enclave of Northeastern Puritans in Sacramento at this time, the saloon story carries on. Now, what about vigilance and vigilante committees? We do see that between 1849 and 1853, there is an element of lawlessness in California because we see 200 vigilante killings during that 4-year stretch. But when we get to 1859 through 1853 or 1863, we only have 20 vigilante killings taking place. So we do see, at least according to these statistics, a normalization of California and these civic institutions, these institutions that dispense punishment for crime, being much more effective. We also see demographic shifts, right? I've got to say that, between 1850 and 1860, 90% of the population in California is male, and 70% of that population is between the ages of 20 and 40. So tailor-made for folks wanting to have fun, wanting to find refuge in saloons, wanting to drink their woes away. It's hard to find stuff up in the placer. It's tough to find stuff when you're dry digging or wet digging. There's a lot of heartbreak. And so these men, mostly men, are going to find refuge in saloons. But soon they're going to go away. They're going to go back to Michigan. They're going to go back to Peru. They're going to go back to China. Okay. So that is the story of Frederick Roe. Now, let's take a look at the Elephant House. So if I'm a miner and I'm coming up the Sacramento River, I've hopped on a ship in San Francisco Bay, I'm going to hit Sutter's Embarcadero, and right before you is what I'm going to see. And mind you, this is 1850. George Victor Cooper's bird's eye view, and right in the middle you can see the Elephant House, and it's at the Elephant House that I can stay for $2 a night. The Elephant House is a hotel. It's massive. Bird's eye view, not drawn to scale, really at all. So it's about half football field back. So it's 50 yards back. It's 40 yards wide. The cots are triple stacked for men to stay. And so for $2 a night, you can stay. 50 cents a night, you get food and a cigar at the Elephant House. And just for clarification, the elephant is the metaphor that was used often to describe the California Gold Rush and the idea of going to see the elephant. Now, really quickly, I do want to point out that right next door to the Elephant House is the El Dorado Exchange. And the names we choose for saloons at this time typically reflect the zeitgeist. What's going on in the news? What's going on in world history? What's going on in culture? And so in this case, the El Dorado, indicative of this land of gold, but we also have names like the Sazerac, which is America's very first cocktail. So the Sazerac Saloon. We also have the Mazeppa Saloon, which was a poem written in the early 19th century by Lord Byron and then made into a symphony by Franz Liszt. So there was the the Mazeppa Saloon. There was the Fraser River Saloon when people found gold and silver along the Fraser River. So also just a really great way of marketing whatever you're going to do and keeping with the times and just trying to create a bit of a hook to get folks in. Okay, so what did the inside of these places look like, these saloons? Well, really the very best view we've got is this lithograph of the El Dorado Gambling Saloon that appeared in the 1852 Illustrated London News. This is it, folks. This is the best view we have of the interior of a Sacramento saloon, and it is the El Dorado Gambling Saloon, which would have been on the northeast corner of 2nd and J. And so think about what's there today. A freeway, I think. But back in the day, this was a spot to be. And so you can see this polyglot, multiracial, multi-ethnic mosh of gamblers going at it. And then you can see the mixologist over there making a mountaineer, not making a Sazerac, but making some sort of punch. And then in the back, you can see up on a terrace, musicians doing their thing. And I can just say, parenthetically, the music was notoriously bad in Sacramento saloons for a very, very long time. That isn't to say that there weren't great performers that came through. Mischka Hauser, Austrian violin virtuoso, came through with Lola Montez. They traveled together. So he would play the violin, and every once in a while she would do her spider dance to entertain those who would be there. Okay, so the next concept I want to talk about is when you've got a saloon and you've got many of them, the products are very similar, right? You can get your beer from the Sacramento/Galena Brewery. You can get your liquor from the Lady Adams house. You can get your stuff from wherever, but you have to find something to set yourself apart. This is capitalism 101 when it comes down to it. So I refer to this whole thing as the hook. You have to have something special to bring folks in. And the first thing we're going to see here relates to bloomers. Bloomers, you may know what bloomers are. So Amelia Bloomer on the East Coast came up with this concept of fashion comfort. Dresses at this time are heavy. They're made of canvas, gingham, any other several types of textiles, but generally very uncomfortable, especially if you're in the American West where it's warm and it's dusty. Well, in this case, the bloomer was the thing, and approved by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, gave her seal of approval. But the idea of the bloomer was sort of marketed by these tours that would go all across the country, go to large cities, but this tour even came out to the West Coast. And so a fellow named Samuel Colville, who ran a saloon called the Oriental, went ahead and said, you know what, I'll take that exhibit. And wouldn't you know it, it was an extremely popular way to get these men, 70% of whom were between the ages of 20 and 40. Only 7% of the population in California in 1850 was made up of women, and so they barely ever saw a woman. But what a thrill it would have been, how titillating it would have been to actually see these wonderful clothes and these concepts of fashion and this thing called bloomers. Now, something I do want to be able to run by you is that women were treated quite well in antebellum Sacramento. In fact, John Bessenecker, who is a historian of early California, concluded, based on statistics he could find on crime and punishment, that today there's a five times more likely chance of a woman being assaulted than there was during the California Gold Rush. Women were venerated. The concept of chivalry was alive and well, and just to see a woman would make minors think of their sisters, girlfriends, mothers, daughters. So an important thing to add. But this traveling tour look of the bloomer was a serious hook. Now, another hook is art. Charles Hume, who's professor, longtime professor over at Sacramento State in theater, comes clean and says, these men aren't all boobs. They are cultured. They have likes. They have desires. They enjoy good art. They enjoy good music. And in this case, we see the power of music, which is a piece of art that appeared at the Oregon Bowling Saloon. William Sidney Mount painted this picture, and it circulated. And again, it's another thing that was out there to bring people into saloons. Now, a pivot point, 1852, we have the Great Fire. And with this Great Fire, we have basically the razing of 70% of the city of Sacramento. So what this is, it's not only a tragedy, but it is a massive economic reset for Sacramento. And all of those saloons that were established, institutionalized, doing so well are now gone. So at this point, we have a rush, if you will, to mine the miners, right? And so we have people coming in from all over the country to set up saloons to service the hundreds and thousands of miners in the city. And one of the true rock stars in a case study in this situation is a fellow named John C. Keenan. Absolutely the most talented saloonist, that's my word, during Sacramento and the Gold Rush. Keenan was an Irishman who did it all, came over from Ireland, was part of the Texas Rangers for a short period of time, came to California to be part of the Gold Rush, but he opened up what was known as the Fashion Saloon, which we'll look at in a second, the actual final iteration of. But after the 1852 fire, Keenan was in Sacramento. Mining wasn't working out, but he thought, I can do this saloon thing. So he went upriver, Sacramento River, to a place called Vernon. He found a prefabricated structure. He floated it down the Sacramento River to Sacramento, set it up as the Fashion. And again, think of this laissez-faire economic scenario where only the best and most talented business folk are really going to win in the end. And that's what Keenan did. He set up the Fashion Saloon, and we'll look at the next iteration of it. And here it is, just before redevelopment. Beautiful cast iron facade, which is a huge part of the American West, made here in Sacramento at the Eureka Foundry. And by 1865, that structure had been raised. But again, it's not the saloon so much and possibly what they're selling that makes it so great oftentimes, and certainly in the case of John C. Keenan, it's who's running the place, who brings the excitement, who brings the toil and hard work. And in this case, it was Keenan. Keenan also operated a racetrack. He was a manager of a racetrack. Now, we're going to take a look at the Louisiana racetrack in just a second here. And why am I talking about racetracks? Well, horse racing was a huge draw during the Gold Rush in Sacramento. And Keenan came up with the idea of actually having salooning features within racetracks just to add another aspect, another lure to bring folks in. Now, the Louisiana racetrack that's pictured here would have been located up on present-day Centerville Road and Franklin, back then known as Whiskey Hill Road instead of Centerville. The number of Southerners that had come over to California really helped enhance the development of horse racing, not only as an entertainment form, but also as a point of gambling, and just taking a little bit of what they had in the South and bringing it out here. There was huge demand for horse racing at the time. Now, Keenan ran the Sutter racetrack, which was located near the Alhambra Triangle of today. And again, it's there where he really introduced salooning as being a feature of the Sacramento racetrack. All right, so let's talk about a personality. Now, and pivot back to brewing, we've got this guy named Louis Kesselberg. Now, Louis Kesselberg, a German, came over from Prussia, an unsteady fellow, irritable, angry, mad at a lot of people. He's probably mad at me, his ghost is, just for talking about him. Well, the thing about Kesselberg is he was a member of the Donner Party. So 1846, 1847, Donner Party, and he may have actually been one of those folks who got so hungry that he had to do that thing. I just don't want to say it. But anyway, after the Donner Party tragedy, he comes to Sacramento. He becomes a ship captain, sailing up and down the Sacramento. Doesn't work out too well. So he pivots over to brewing. He's a German, he brews, he knows about it. And he is one of the very first brewmasters to introduce lager beers to the salooning scene. Lager beers stored for a very long period of time. Lager is a term that derives from the German term lagern, which means to store. So the beer is fermented at a low temperature for a long period of time. And the lager beer is an absolute craze. Kesselberg opens the Phoenix Brewery in Sacramento, and he makes money hand over fist, becomes very, very rich, but still mean and still irritable and probably not great to be around. Okay, so moving on, another brewery, another German brewery pops up in what today we would call Alkali Flat, and this is the Ohio Brewery. And what's great about the Ohio Brewery, and this is roughly 7th and G, the Ohio Brewery is one of the very first breweries that introduces on-site drinking and group event venues, which is pretty cool. So you've got the Ohio Brewery where you can go and have a beer, but you can also go to their depot, which was located on 4th and K, and you can get a beer there as well. Kind of reminds me of Track 7 in a lot of ways. So this place was operated by a German named Anton Müller, and there are more to come. So let's talk about the changing demographics of Sacramento. So in 1852, we know that roughly 250,000 people came through the Golden Gate to California, okay? But by 1853, about 150,000, that's roughly 70% of that original number, had gone back through the Golden Gate, which means they were done. They were finished. Mining didn't work out, or they got what they needed, or they just wanted to go home. That's it. So what this means is California is normalizing. We're going from this hurly-burly, rough and ready environment of saloons to a different vibe. And in this case, we see the El Dorado, the post-El Dorado gaming image right here. So remember earlier I showed you that picture out of the Illustrated London News. Well, right here we see what this place looks like in about 1855. It's not saloons, folks. It's hat making. It's dry goods. It's wholesome. And in terms of forms of entertainment, we don't have gaming, but we have the Sacramento Philharmonic. We have the German Turnverein popping up. We have a Lyceum where we can discuss the merits and demerits of the French Revolution. All of these things that are much more interesting than salooning, right? And by 1855, all banking games or house games are illegal. So really the only game you can play after 1855 that's legal is poker. That's not a banking game. That's a game that 3 people can play. No house involved. Okay, so California is basically normalizing. So next image here is of the gravesite of Maria Rupp. Now, the German influence during antebellum Sacramento is massive. We have German names all throughout Sacramento history. We have Ruhstaller, we have Heilbronn, we have Dreyer, we have Teichert. Those are all German names. But this goes back long, long ways. And the German community in Sacramento, either by way of the California Gold Rush or the revolutions of 1848 deposited all sorts of Germans in this area. It was a strong, tightly knit community, and at the center of that community was a woman named Maria Rupp. Now, Maria ran a saloon called the Sacramento Beer Saloon. In 1857, it was in its heyday. Maria was beautiful, she was talented, she was a wonderful business person, she played the piano, she sang. People just wanted to be around her. Well, there was one fellow named Peter Metz. He was kind of like Kesselberg, not really that stable. And even though Maria had told him several times, "I'm good, I don't need a man, I've got a man already," Peter wouldn't take no for an answer. And so one night, Maria is in the Sacramento Beer Saloon and she's playing her piano and she's singing away. And Peter comes up to her and asks her one more time to marry him. She says no. Peter pulls out a big knife, stabs Maria right there. She falls to the ground, and absolute crestfallen is the German community in Sacramento. A true superstar is gone. And so Metz escapes, goes up to Siskiyou County, is eventually captured, brought down to Stockton, and then into San Quentin, where he rots away. But Maria is gone. It's a huge event. Hundreds of people attend her funeral. She's taken down to the Old City Cemetery. Young German girls sing old German songs as she's laid to rest. And of course, you can see right here where she's buried at the Old City Cemetery. Now, a legendary bit is we know that 4 years after Maria dies, her love, a French physician named Francois Noisette, he dies 4 years later of tuberculosis. They were to be married, but of course Metz changed all that. Legend has it, it's a thing, legend has it that Noisette made sure that his heart was removed from his body and buried next to Maria. And you can see just to the side of that headstone, a very small headstone on the ground. And it's there where it's inscribed, Toi, Marie, for Marie, or connected to Marie, the heart of Noisette. We don't know for sure, but that's the story, folks. Okay, one more story to wrap things up is relative to the Civil War. So we're coming to the end of antebellum Sacramento, and we see the Centerville Brewery right in front of you right here, which is operated by a little German guy named Martin Ahrens. German, that word comes up a lot. But this would be located near present-day Riverside Boulevard and Centerville Road. And again, the Civil War has just started. There is a Union unit in the area, and they need to be trained. They first train over on the Yolo River side of the Sacramento River, or the Yolo County side of the American River. That doesn't work out. They move over to the Sacramento side, and they settle in an area very close to the Centerville Brewery. In fact, there is a plaque there today that pays homage to Camp Union. And it's there that this unit sets up shop. And it's there late 1861, and they're there. They're not drinking. They're not gambling. They're bored. It's cold. They need entertainment. They get word that there's a brewery just down the road called the Centerville Brewery. So a unit of bluecoats gets together that evening, and they make their way down Centerville to the west. And they end up at the brewery, and they think it's just a matter of opening the door, and we will be able to sip a fine lager beer, and that's it. And so they open the door, and much to their surprise, are several large German men with sticks ready to repel them. The Union soldiers, they're not bothered, so a fight ensues. Little Martin Ahrens, little guy, pops out with a Colt revolver, fires a few shots. That seems to take care of things a bit. A relief team is sent from Camp Union to the Centerville Brewery to quell things. But it is true that the Union Army went to battle in Sacramento, but not against Johnny Reb, but against a bunch of German brewers. So that is a flight through Sacramento salooning, brewing, gambling, any number of things, which should hopefully give you a pretty good sense of the salooning culture in Sacramento at this time. There are things that I skipped, things relative to saloons being political hubs for the Whigs, the Democrats, the know-nothings, huge part of Sacramento life at the time. But again, if we look at saloons, we can look at them as a vignette that not only tells us about American culture, but the entire zeitgeist of Sacramento in the nation. So, with that said, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this ACC Senior Services program. Simply put, ACC Senior Services is a dynamite organization. They are a top-flight production team when it comes to their classes and getting the word out about all these different things for folks to do. They're just so darn good. So we love the partnership, and we hope to see you all again soon. I also want to alert you all on Saturday, the 19th at 2 o'clock. Professor Aaron Cohen will be joining me as we talk about the Ukraine crisis. So if you want to learn more about that program, go to www.saclibrary.org, click on events, click on the 19th, and you'll see the program there for Ukraine. We're going to be taking questions. Professor Cohen will give an overview, the historical context, and answer as many questions as he can for you. We're so lucky to have Sac State just right down the road where we can get these great experts to shed some light on some really confusing topics. So with that said, thank you. Come to the Sacramento Room to learn about history. Come see me. Talk about Angry, Louis Kesselberg. So many things we can do. So until then, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you soon.